There's a pair of shoes sitting in a glass case in Rawlins, Wyoming, that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the Old West. I'm not talking about some replica or prop from a movie. I'm talking about actual Victorian-era dress shoes that you can walk up to and look at with your own eyes. And when you read the story behind them, you'll wish you hadn't. Walk into the Carbon County Museum on any given day, and you'll see what you'd expect. Dusty displays of frontier life, old saddles cracked with age, rusted rifles that haven't been fired in over a century, sepia-toned photographs of stern-faced pioneers who look like they've never smiled a day in their goddamn lives. The kind of small-town historical museum that smells like mothballs and wood polish, where the floorboards creak under your feet and everything's got that brownish tint that screams 1800s. You're walking through, maybe half paying attention, probably checking your phone because, let's be honest, most of this stuff is pretty standard fare for a Wyoming historical society. And then you stop because there's this one display case that doesn't quite fit. Inside are a pair of brown leather shoes. They look normal at first glance, not remarkable in any way. Weathered, sure, hand-stitched in that way that tells you they're old as hell. Victorian-era gentlemen's dress shoes, the kind a well-to-do man might have worn to church or to a business meeting. They've got that two-tone coloring, kind of tan, kind of brown. The leather's cracked in places, worn smooth in others. Honestly, if you saw them at a garage sale, you'd walk right past them. But then you read the placard, and the placard reads something along the lines of, "Shoes made from the skin of Outlaw, Big Nose George Parrott, 1881. Now, most people see that and they laugh. They think it's got to be some kind of frontier tall tale, right? Some macabre joke cooked up by locals to mess with tourists. I mean, come on. Human skin shoes? That's the kind of thing you see in a horror movie, not a reputable museum in small-town Wyoming. Except it's not a joke. Chemical analysis confirmed it. Multiple tests over the years, different labs, different methods. That leather? It's human. Tanned like cowhide, treated like any other piece of hide you'd get off a cow or a horse. But it came from a man named George Parrott, who, as we'll get into, made some very poor life choices back in 1878. And these shoes didn't just sit in some creepy collector's basement gathering dust. Oh no, these shoes walked into the Wyoming governor's mansion. They were worn to an inaugural ball. Some doctor-turned-politician actually laced these bad boys up, looked at himself in the mirror and thought, yeah, these human skin loafers really tie the outfit together. I'm not making this up. I couldn't make this up if I tried. The museum acquired them in 1950, and even that discovery is straight out of a mystery novel. See, they were doing some demolition work on an old building in downtown Rawlins. Just your standard tear it down and build something new situation. Construction workers are knocking down walls, hauling out debris, and somebody finds this old whiskey barrel that's been sealed up and buried under the floorboards for God knows how long. They crack it open expecting, I don't know, maybe some antique bottles or old documents, or possibly just a bunch of rotted wood. Instead, they find human bones, half a skull, and a pair of leather shoes. You can imagine the panic that ensued. Somebody probably shit themselves. The police get called. Is this a crime scene? Did we just uncover a murder from last week? But no, these bones are old, real old. And pretty soon the locals start putting two and two together because Rawlins has a very specific history when it comes to bodies in barrels and outlaws getting turned into leather goods. The initial reaction was disbelief. Even the people who'd heard the stories, the old-timers who'd grown up with whispers about what happened to Big Nose George, even they figured it was mostly legend. You know how these frontier stories get embellished over the years? A guy gets hanged and suddenly 50 years later, there's a tale about his skin getting made into a tobacco pouch or some shit. But they started authenticating, and they found a woman, Lillian Heath. She was still alive in 1950, 85 years old, sharp as a tack. And she'd been 15 years old back in 1881 when she worked as an assistant to the town doctor. She remembered the whole damn thing. She even still had a piece of the puzzle. The doctors had given her the top portion of George Parrott's skull after they were done with him, and she'd been using it as an ashtray in a doorstop and at one point a little flower pot for 70 years. I'm not kidding. This woman had a dead outlaw's skull cap sitting on her desk holding pencils. So she brings it in. They compare it to the skull fragments from the barrel. And guess what? Perfect match. They've got dental records, old photographs, written accounts from the 1880s, chemical analysis, documentation. It all lines up. The bones belong to Big Nose George. And those shoes? Yeah, they were made from his skin, all right. His chest skin specifically, though we'll get to exactly how that happened later. So how does a human being become footwear? This is a story about the American frontier at its most savage, at its most absolutely unhinged, a time and place where the line between justice and barbarism, between civilization and chaos, between doctor and ghoul, just completely disappeared. See, we like to romanticize the Old West. Cowboys and sheriffs and noble gunfights and dusty streets, good guys versus bad guys, justice prevailing. But the reality was so much weirder and darker and more fucked up than any movie ever showed you. To understand these shoes, we need to go back to August 1878 and a botched train robbery that ended with 2 dead lawmen and 1 outlaw who'd become famous for all the wrong reasons. George Parrott was born around 1834, probably in Missouri or maybe Arkansas. Records are unclear, which is pretty standard for the era. A lot of people on the frontier didn't exactly keep meticulous birth certificates, especially poor people, and George's family was definitely poor. We don't know much about his early life because, honestly, he wasn't important enough for anyone to care. No famous relatives, no notable achievements, nothing that would have made someone write down his story. He was just another forgotten kid who drifted west looking for something better. His big claim to fame was his nose. And I mean this sincerely. By all accounts, this thing was fucking enormous. Prominent, bulbous, impossible to miss or forget. The kind of nose that enters a room before you do. That's how he got his nickname, and probably how witnesses identified him so easily later on. Not exactly ideal for a career criminal, if we're being honest. George was a small-time criminal his entire adult life. Cattle rustling, stagecoach robberies, petty shit that might get you a few months in jail, but nothing that would make you famous or feared. He was never the brains of any operation, always just muscle. The kind of guy who'd hold the horses while the real criminals did the actual robbing. He'd spent time in various territorial jails across Wyoming, Montana, Utah. He was known to law enforcement, but he wasn't infamous. He wasn't Billy the Kid or Jesse James. He was just another drifter committing crimes to survive. Contemporary descriptions of George are not flattering. Loudmouthed, one source called him. A braggart, not particularly bright. The kind of guy who'd walk into a saloon after pulling a robbery and basically tell everyone within earshot what he'd just done. Operational security was not George's strong suit. He drank heavily. He talked too much. He had the kind of personality that made even other outlaws roll their eyes and avoid him when possible. But here's the thing, and this is important to understand George's mindset in 1878. He was desperate. The dude was pushing mid-40s, which in frontier terms might as well be elderly. He had nothing to show for his life. No money, no property, no prospects. He'd spent 2 decades committing crimes and had fuck all to show for it. He was getting older. His health was probably shit from years of hard living, and he knew he was running out of time. He needed a big score. One last job. The kind of payday that would set him up for life, or at least give him enough money to retire from the outlaw business, and maybe buy a small ranch somewhere nobody knew his name. And he partnered up with a guy named Dutch Charlie Burris, real name Charles Bates, but everybody called him Dutch. Charlie. Now Dutch was a career criminal, more experienced than George, a little smarter, a little more careful. Together they'd pulled small jobs across Montana, Wyoming, Utah. Nothing spectacular, nothing that got them rich, just enough to keep them in whiskey and ammunition. They recruited a few other desperate idiots, guys whose names are mostly lost to history because they didn't survive long enough to become famous. And together they hatched a plan to rob a Union Pacific train. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Loosen some railroad spikes near Medicine Bow, Wyoming. When the train comes barreling through at speed, the wheels push the rail aside. The train derails, cars tumble and crash, passengers are thrown around, chaos everywhere. And in that confusion, while everyone's screaming and bleeding and trying to figure out what the hell just happened, George and the boys would hit the express car, grab the payroll, rob any wealthy passengers for good measure, and then vanish into the wilderness or before law enforcement could even be notified. It's not a terrible plan, honestly. Train robberies were happening all over the West using similar methods. Jesse James had derailed trains. It could work if you knew what you were doing and had a little bit of luck on your side. George Parrott had neither of those things. The plan was simple. Loosen some railroad spikes near Medicine Bow, Wyoming. When the train comes barreling through, the wheels push the rail aside. Train derails. They rob the express car in the chaos. August 16th, 1878. They finish sabotaging the track and hide in the rocks waiting for the train. But Union Pacific section workers show up first, spot the damage, and fix it. George and his gang watch from hiding as these workers hammer the spikes back in and ruin their whole plan. Now they've got a choice. Give up or wait and try again. George decides to wait, and that's when two deputies show up to investigate. The sabotage. Deputy Robert Widowfield, 34 years old, married, experienced manhunter, and Deputy Henry Vincent, 26, engaged to be married, former railroad worker. They track the gang's trail into Rattlesnake Canyon. The gang sets an ambush. Narrow canyon, rocks on both sides, classic kill zone. August 19th, early afternoon. The deputies ride in. Widowfield catches the first bullet in the chest, falls from his horse, dead before he hits the ground. The gang keeps shooting, riddles his body with 5 to 7 more rounds. Vincent sees his partner fall, tries to wheel his horse around and run, takes a bullet in the back, falls wounded, tries to crawl to cover. The gang rushes down and finishes him execution style. Shot in the head at close range. They rifle through the bodies, take the badges, guns, horses, maybe $40 in cash, then scatter. George and Dutch Charlie head to Montana. They think they got away clean. They have no idea what they've actually done. See, here's the thing about crime in the Old West. Killing a train robber, that's expected. Robbing stages, rustling cattle, even shooting it out with other outlaws. All part of the game. But killing deputies, lawmen doing their jobs, that's declaring war on the entire social order. That's saying you don't just break the rules, you reject the very concept of rules. Wyoming erupts. This becomes the largest manhunt in territory history up to that point. The Union Pacific Railroad puts up reward money, $500 per outlaw, dead or alive. And we're talking 1878 money here. That's like $15,000 today. That's the kind of money that turns friends into informants and fellow outlaws into bounty hunters. Wanted posters go up everywhere: Montana, Dakota Territory, Utah, Colorado, anywhere the gang might run. And for George, that wanted poster is a problem because his most distinguishing feature, that massive nose, is right there in the description. Big Nose George. Once you see that schnoz, you don't forget it. Sheriff James Rankin in Carbon County makes it his personal mission. These were his men. He sent them out there. He's the one who has to look their widows in the eye and tell them their husbands aren't coming home. He swears he'll see every single member of that gang hang. For nearly 2 years, George and Dutch Charlie live under fake names in Montana. They work as ranch hands, keep their heads down, don't cause trouble. They probably think they're safe. Montana's a different jurisdiction, different territory, and without photographs on the wanted posters, it's easy enough to use a fake name and blend in. George calls himself George Manus or George Mason, depending on who's asking. Dutch Charlie goes by Charles Williams. They're just a couple more drifters in a sea of drifters, working for low wages and trying not to draw attention. But George can't help himself. He never could. He starts drinking in the local saloons. And when George drinks, he talks. Starts bragging about jobs he pulled back in Wyoming. About outsmarting the law. About how he's cleverer than all those dumb lawmen who couldn't catch him. And people listen. And people remember. Especially that nose. July 1880, almost 2 full years after the murders. George gets drunk in a Miles City, Montana saloon. Really drunk. And he starts bragging to some prostitutes about his time in Wyoming, about trouble with the law, about narrow escapes and close calls. He doesn't come right out and say he killed deputies. He's not quite that stupid, but he hints at it. Talks about it in that way drunks do when they want credit for something but don't want to fully admit it. One of the women has seen the wanted poster, and once George starts running his mouth, she takes a good look at his face. More specifically, his nose. Yeah, that's him. She waits till he leaves, then sends word to the local marshal. Quietly, carefully, because if George realizes he's been made, he'll run again. The marshal organizes a small group, plans to take George at his boarding house early in the morning when he's hungover and less likely to fight back. And that's exactly what happens. Early morning, George is still drunk from the night before, probably passed out in his bed. The marshal and his deputies kick in the door, drag George out still in his underwear, slap the shackles on him before he even understands what's happening. He gives his name as George Manus, tries to maintain the lie. But that nose doesn't lie. The marshal wires Sheriff Rankin in Wyoming. We got him. He's transported by train back to Wyoming. At each stop, crowds gather. They throw rocks, spit, shout threats. Hang him now. String him up. Late July 1880, the train pulls into Rawlins. 200 people waiting at the station, chanting for his blood. Sheriff Rankin rushes George to the Carbon County Jail. George can hear the mob outside all night, chanting, wanting him dead. Dutch Charlie gets captured separately a few weeks later, both of them locked up knowing a lynch mob is coming. August 1880, after dark, the mob forms, over 100 men. They batter down the jail door, drag Dutch Charlie out screaming, and hang him from a telegraph pole on Front Street. Slow strangulation. Takes several minutes to die. Body left hanging as a warning. George watches from his cell window. Knows he's next. His trial happens in December. Guilty verdict in less than an hour. Sentenced to death by hanging, April 2nd, 1881. George sits in jail for 4 months knowing exactly when he's going to die. But he's not the type to just wait around. March 22nd, 1881. 11 days before his scheduled execution. George has been filing away at his ankle shackles for weeks with a smuggled knife. He finally breaks free. When guard Robert Rankin enters his cell, George attacks. Stabs him with the knife, but Rankin's wife Rosa hears the screaming, runs in with an iron rod, and beats George over the head until he surrenders. News spreads. The mob outside swells to 200 people. They're done waiting. 11 p.m. they break into the jail, drag George out to the same telegraph pole where Dutch Charlie died. Put the noose around his neck. George begs. Offers to confess everything. Tell them where the money is, anything. The mob doesn't care. They hoist him up. No measured drop, just slow strangulation. George kicks and struggles for 5 to 10 minutes before he finally stops moving. His body gets cut down and dragged to the undertaker. And that's where Dr. John Eugene Osborne enters the story. Let me tell you about Dr. Osborne because understanding who he was makes what he did even more disturbing. John Eugene Osborne was born in 1858 in Burlington, Vermont. Educated at the University of Vermont Medical School, graduated in 1880, 1 year before George Parrott was lynched. He moved to Wyoming Territory that same year, 22 years old, fresh out of medical school, full of ambition and looking for opportunity on the frontier. And Rawlins needed a doctor badly. The town only had one other physician, and with all the railroad workers getting injured, miners getting sick, cowboys getting shot in saloons, there was plenty of work to go around. Osborne set up his practice quickly, made friends with Sheriff Rankin, with county officials, with the business owners. Became a respected, even beloved member of the community. He attended George's trial, sat in the courtroom taking notes, watched the mob form outside the jail night after night. And when George was lynched, when that body was cut down from the telegraph pole and dragged to the undertaker, Dr. Osborne had an idea. He claimed the body for medical study. And here's the thing, this was completely legal in the 1880s. It was standard practice. Doctors could claim executed criminals' bodies for anatomical research. Medical schools did it all the time. It was justified as advancing medical science, also providing cadavers for education, helping future doctors learn anatomy without having to resort to grave robbing. The reality was that these bodies often became trophies, curiosities, conversation pieces. But even by those standards, what Osborne did was extreme. First thing he does is make a death mask. This part is actually standard procedure. You make a plaster cast of the person's face while the body's still fresh, before decomposition sets in. You spread plaster over the face, let it dry, peel it off. It creates this eerie three-dimensional replica that preserves every detail. George's death mask shows his eyes closed, mouth slightly open, every wrinkle and feature of his face frozen forever. The death mask still exists. It's in the Carbon County Museum right next to the shoes. You can go see it. It's unsettling as hell because it looks so lifelike, like George is just sleeping and might wake up any second. But then Osborne does something that is definitely, absolutely 100% not standard medical procedure. He skins George Parrott, not the whole body. That would be impractical and frankly too much work. But specific sections, large sections of chest skin, thigh skin. He uses scalpels, makes precise cuts, removes the skin like he's field dressing a deer for taxidermy. This is not about advancing medical science. This is not about teaching anatomy to students. This is souvenir taking, pure and simple. Osborne sends the skin to a tannery. Accounts vary on whether it was in Denver or somewhere local, but either way, he tells them it's animal hide. The tannery either doesn't know it's human or doesn't ask questions. They just process it like any other piece of cowhide using standard 1880s methods. Chromium tanning or vegetable tanning, same techniques you'd use for making belts or saddles. The result is leather that's completely indistinguishable from cow or horse hide. You couldn't tell by looking at it, touching it, or even smelling it. It's just leather, brown, supple, ready to be worked. The tan skin comes back to Osborne, and he takes the chest skin, this large section of what used to be Big Nose George Parrott, to a local cobbler. Orders a pair of dress shoes, Victorian style, lace-up, pointed toe, two-tone coloring. The cobbler makes them, and whether he knows what the leather really is, we don't know for certain. He might not have asked, he just makes the shoes. Quality craftsmanship, too. Well-made, professional work. They're not crude or obviously weird. They look like normal Victorian gentleman's dress shoes, the kind you'd wear to church or to a business meeting. They fit Osborne's feet perfectly. He was about 5'9", average build, and he wears them. We don't know if he wore them every single day, possibly, but he definitely wore them on special occasions. Most famously, and we have documentation of this, he wore them to his gubernatorial inaugural ball in 1893. Let that sink in for a second. Dr. John Eugene Osborne walked into the Wyoming governor's mansion wearing shoes made from the skin of an outlaw he'd helped lynch 12 years earlier. But Osborne didn't stop with the shoes. He made other items too. A coin purse from George's thigh skin, small, pocket-sized, the kind of thing you'd carry in your vest. He reportedly used it for years, possibly decades. Current whereabouts unknown. Probably in some dusty attic or thrown away when he died. He made a medical bag, a doctor's instrument bag for carrying his tools and supplies, made from the remaining skin, and he used it in his practice. Think about that for a second. You're a patient in Rawlins, Wyoming. You're sick, you call the doctor. Dr. Osborne shows up at your door with his stethoscope and his thermometer and all it, medical instruments in a bag made from human skin. He kept George's skull. After removing the brain for study, which, okay, that's at least plausibly scientific, even if the science was bullshit phrenology. But after he removed the brain, he kept the skull cap, the top portion of the skull, and he used it as a doorstop, an ashtray, a paperweight. Accounts vary on which it was, might have been all three at different times. Just treated it like a novelty item you'd pick up at a roadside stand. Why did nobody stop him? Legally, there was nothing to stop. It wasn't illegal to claim a criminal's body or make leather from human skin. This was Wyoming Territory, not even a state yet. And George was a cop killer. Society didn't care what happened to his body. Culturally, frontier people valued revenge and dominance over outlaws. Some saw the shoes as the ultimate justice. The outlaw literally beneath civilized society's feet. And Osborne was a respected doctor with social status. That protected him. If this happened today, Osborne would be charged with desecration of human remains, lose his medical license, probably go to jail. But in 1881, it was legal, socially acceptable, and actually career-enhancing. The shoes helped make Osborne famous. He became known as the doctor with the outlaw shoes. People remembered his name. He got into politics, joined the Democratic Party, got elected to local positions, then state legislature. In 1892, he ran for governor of Wyoming. He won. January 1893, John Eugene Osborne was inaugurated as governor of Wyoming. There's an inaugural ball that evening, and Osborne wore the shoes. The shoes made from Big Nose George Parrott's chest skin, wore them to the governor's mansion. By this point, everyone knew about the shoes. It wasn't a secret. Some Democrats thought it was hilarious. Republicans were disgusted but couldn't make it a scandal. The national press reported on it with mixed reactions. Nobody stopped him. Osborne served one term as governor, mediocre but not terrible. Lost re-election due to economic depression. Went back to practicing medicine. Then in 1913, President Woodrow Wilson appointed him Assistant Secretary of State. Osborne moved to Washington, D.C. and brought the shoes with him. He wore them to State Department functions. The Assistant Secretary of State, walking around the nation's capital in shoes made from a lynched outlaw. Washington society was horrified and fascinated. He'd tell the story at dinner parties, show off the shoes, never expressed a hint of regret. After Wilson's presidency, Osborne returned to Wyoming, semi-retired, continued practicing medicine part-time, became a legend. Visitors would come specifically to see the shoes, and he'd show them willingly. Never expressed regret, not once in over 60 years. Osborne died April 24, 1943, 84 years old. His obituary mentioned his governorship, his medical career, and yes, the shoes. National newspaper headlines. Governor who wore dead outlaw's skin dies. His family inherited the shoes and death mask, kept them private for years. Most people forgot about them. Until 1950, building renovation in Rawlins. Workers find the shoes in a storage room along with the death mask and old documents. Nobody knows what they are at first. Then someone reads the news clippings. Holy shit, these are the shoes. University of Wyoming authenticates them. Chemical analysis confirms human leather. The Carbon County Museum asks Osborne's descendants to donate them. The family agrees. 1951, the shoes go on permanent display. They become the museum's most famous exhibit. Immediate controversy. Should human remains be displayed? Is this ethical? The museum decides yes, keep displaying them. Educational value, historical significance. They add context explaining frontier justice and medical. Ethics. Visitor reactions are mixed. Most people are horrified and fascinated. Some demand they be buried. Others think they're the most interesting artifact in Wyoming. The shoes remain on display. So what does all of this mean? What are we supposed to take away from the story of Big Nose George Parrott and the shoes made from his skin? Let's start with the basic facts. George Parrott was guilty. There's no question about that. No ambiguity. He confessed, multiple times in fact. There were witnesses, physical evidence, a clearer timeline. He murdered 2 lawmen in an ambush, shot them in cold blood, left their bodies in a canyon for the coyotes. There's absolutely no doubt about his culpability. Did he deserve to hang? By 1880 standards, absolutely. By any standard, really. Cop killing was a capital offense everywhere. Still is in many places. A legal execution date was already set. He would have hanged on April 2nd, 1881, with a judge and witnesses, and all the proper legal procedures. Due process, as much as that existed in Wyoming Territory. So why did the mob kill him 11 days early? Impatience, for one thing. They didn't want to wait. 2 years they'd been waiting for justice. 2 years of wanted posters and frustration and watching the slow wheels of frontier law grind along. But there was also revenge, personal revenge. George's escape attempt had involved attacking Robert Rankin, the sheriff's son. This became deeply personal for the Rankin family and for a lot of people in Rawlins. And there was symbolism too. The mob wanted to be the ones to kill him, not the state, not some official executioner hired by the territory. They wanted that satisfaction. They wanted to look George in the eye and be the ones to pull that rope. Here's the difference, and this matters. George's legal execution would have been relatively quick and clean. A measured drop calculated to break his neck instantly, rendered unconscious, immediately, dead within seconds, witnessed by official personnel, documented, recorded for the legal record. The mob lynching was slow, brutal, a public spectacle. They hoisted him up and let him strangle. He kicked and thrashed for 5 to 10 minutes, maybe longer, before his body finally went limp. It was torture, not execution. The outcome is the same either way. He's dead, but the method matters. One represents civilization, law, order. The other represents barbarism, revenge, mob rule. And that's the frontier paradox right there. These communities desperately needed law to survive. But law enforcement was often insufficient. Too few lawmen, too much territory, too many criminals. So mobs filled the gap. Vigilante justice became the norm. Wyoming had this tension until it became a state in 1890. George's lynching happened right in the middle of that transition period, when the territory was trying to prove it was civilized enough for statehood, but couldn't quite stop its citizens from taking the law into their own hands. Then there's what happened to George's body, and this is where things get even more complicated. If Dr. Osborne had just claimed the body for medical study, done a proper autopsy, maybe kept the skeleton for teaching purposes, and then buried the remains afterward, that would have been within the norms of the time. Questionable by modern standards, sure, but acceptable for 1881. But he didn't do that. He skinned a human being and turned him into personal accessories, into fashion items, into conversation pieces. That's not science. That's not education. That's trophy taking, pure and simple. That's treating another human being, even a criminal, as less than human, as an object to be used and displayed. And he wore those shoes for decades. To his gubernatorial inauguration, to State Department functions in Washington, D.C., to dinner parties where he'd tell the story and show them off. He never expressed remorse. Not once in over 60 years of owning those shoes did he ever publicly say, you know what, maybe this was wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. In 1881, this was legal and socially acceptable. Today, Osborne would be charged with desecration of human remains, abuse of a corpse. He'd lose his medical license. He'd probably face criminal charges, definitely jail time. He'd be a pariah, not a governor. His career would be over before it started. But in 1881, it was legal. It was acceptable. It actually enhanced his career. People remembered his name because of those shoes. It made him famous in a weird way, and that fame translated into political success. This gap between then and now shows how radically our values have changed. What we consider acceptable treatment of human remains, even criminals' remains, has shifted dramatically. We have laws now about dignified treatment of the dead, about consent and next of kin, about what can and cannot be done with a human body. But here's what really bothers me about how this story is remembered, and I think this is the most important part. But here's what really bothers me. We remember George because his story is strange. The outlaw who became shoes. It's bizarre, it's grotesque, it sticks in your memory. Meanwhile, who remembers Deputy Robert Widowfield, dead at 34, left a widow, murdered doing his job? Almost nobody mentions him. Who remembers Deputy Henry Vincent, 26 years old, engaged to be married, shot in the back, completely forgotten? Robert Rankin, stabbed by George during the escape attempt, forgotten. Rosa Rankin, who saved her husband's life, forgotten. The real victims are the least remembered because their deaths were normal. 2 more lawmen killed in the line of duty. But George is immortal because of how he died and what happened after. This is the perverse logic of historical memory. The shoes sit in the Carbon County Museum today. They see over 10,000 visitors per year. Most come specifically to see them. There's an ongoing debate about whether they should remain on display. Arguments for historical significance, educational value, primary source evidence. If we hide the shoes, we sanitize history. Arguments against human dignity, even criminals deserve it. George has no descendants to consent. Display perpetuates desecration. We don't need the actual shoes to teach the history. The museum's position is to keep displaying them with proper context. Let visitors decide how to feel. The discomfort is part of the lesson. As for George's other body parts, the coin purse is unknown, possibly destroyed. The medical bag is unknown. The skull cap was likely thrown away after Osborne died. The thigh bones that medical assistant Lillian Heath kept, also unknown. She died in 1962 and her estate was dispersed. The only confirmed surviving artifacts are the shoes, the death mask, and some trial documents. That's all that's left of Big Nose George Parrott. John Osborne lived to 84, died peacefully, and was remembered as a governor, a doctor, and a pioneer. George Parrott died screaming at 47 and became a pair of shoes. Their story raises questions we're still grappling with, about justice and revenge, about what we do to criminals' bodies, about the line between science and trophy-taking, about how we remember the past and which artifacts we preserve. The American frontier claimed to be about law and order, but stories like this reveal it was really about power and revenge, the strong dominating the weak, civilization standing on top of barbarism, literally in Osborne's case. We romanticize the Wild West. We turn it into mythology, cowboys and outlaws and frontier justice. But George's story is both part of that myth and a critique of it. We're fascinated by the shoes because they're grotesque, because they shouldn't exist but they do, because they force us to confront the reality of what frontier justice actually looked like. Not noble sheriffs having fair gunfights in dusty streets, but mobs lynching prisoners, doctors skinning corpses, politicians wearing human flesh to inaugural balls, and everyone just accepting it as normal. Big Nose George Parrott died March 22nd, 1881. 140 plus years later, his skin still sits in a glass case in Rawlins, Wyoming, making us ask, what is justice? What is revenge? What is civilization? And reminding us that the answers are never simple. The shoes that shouldn't exist still exist. The outlaw who should be forgotten is remembered. The deputies who should be honored are forgotten. That's the story of Big Nose George Parrott and the shoes made from his skin.